Hello. Welcome back to Their Voice Matters. I'm Amanda, and today we're looking at 3 small towns, 3 families still searching for answers, and 3 cases that continue to raise more questions than they answer. These stories take place in quiet communities where things like this aren't supposed to happen, and yet the mysteries remain unsolved. First, let's go to Lacine, Kansas, and the case of 23-year-old Alonzo Brooks. A night out with friends, a rural house party, and then vanished without a trace. Alonzo Brooks was a quiet, good-natured 23-year-old who went to a party with a group of friends in rural Kansas one April night in 2004. But by the end of the night, all of his friends had left, and Alonzo had no way home. He was never seen alive again. A month later, his body was found under circumstances so suspicious that the FBI reopened the case and classified it as a potential hate crime. What really happened to Alonzo Brooks that night? And why, after all these years, does it seem like people are still hiding the truth? Alonzo Brooks was born on May 19, 1980, to his parents Billy Brooks Sr. and Maria Ramirez. The youngest of 5 siblings, he had 3 sisters and a brother. Everyone called him Zoe. He was known for being polite, kind-hearted, and a bit of a prankster. His family remembers him as someone who loved football, animals, and spending time with his nieces and nephews. He would often babysit them, and they loved his playful nature. Despite his lighthearted personality, Alonzo was a homebody. His sister Demetria Leslie described him as shy, saying, quote, "He has to warm up to you. He didn't like being around a big crowd of people. But even though he wasn't particularly social, he still got along with everyone." His mother, Maria, still feels his presence today. She said, quote, "He used to get behind me and mess up my hair right after I had it fixed. I used to get so mad at him. But now when I feel my hair being moved by the wind, I figure it's him doing it." Alonzo grew up in Topeka, Kansas, before later moving to Gardner, Kansas, where he lived with his mom. Gardner was a small town of about 13,000 people at the time, located 35 minutes southwest of Kansas City. He was working as a custodian and had a love of sports, especially football and basketball. Just before the party, he had actually injured his ankle while playing sports and was still walking with a slight limp. If Alonzo's story resonates with you, please consider liking, subscribing, or following on podcast platforms. Your support helps bring attention to important cases like this, ensuring their stories aren't forgotten. On April 3rd, 2004, 23-year-old Alonzo got a call about a last-minute house party near Lacine, Kansas, a tiny rural town about 50 miles south of Gardner. With a population of around 1,000 people, Lacine was the type of place that had one gas station and not much else. The party was at a farmhouse and was being thrown for someone who was about to leave for the military. It wasn't some big, well-planned event, just a casual gathering that came together at the last minute. Alonzo wasn't a big partier, but he was excited to go that night. He left with a group of friends, including Justin, Daniel, Tyler, and a few others from Gardner. Justin picked up Alonzo from his house and then drove him there, while the others followed in separate cars. When they arrived, it was what you would expect from a country house party: music, drinking games, dancing, and a crowd of about 100 people, mostly between 16 and 21 years old. But one thing stood out. Alonzo was one of only about 3 black men at the party. Lacine was a predominantly white town, and some locals weren't exactly welcoming. Justin later recalled, quote, "There were some people at the party that had problems with people's skin color. Despite this, Alonzo was in high spirits. His friends were even surprised to see him so outgoing, laughing and having fun. Still, there was an unspoken divide in the crowd. One of Alonzo's friends later described it as a tight-knit country clique, with the group from Gardner feeling somewhat like they were outsiders. As the night went on, things started to shift. Reports suggest that fights broke out, though some say it was no more than just some heated arguments. What's more concerning is that there were allegedly racist comments made about and directly to Alonzo. At one point, tensions escalated, and Alonzo was seen arguing with another man. Witnesses say they had to be separated, but after that, Alonzo seemed to shake it off, continuing to joke around and enjoy himself. Then, the party started breaking up. By around 11 p.m., some of Alonzo's friends decided to leave to go to another party. Since they came in separate cars, people assumed that someone else would make sure Alonzo got home. One friend left, thinking that Justin would drive Alonzo back home since they arrived together. Justin, meanwhile, stepped outside for a cigarette, but he realized he was out. He went to ask Alonzo for one, only to find out that Alonzo was out too. So, Justin made the decision to make a quick trip to go buy some more. Alonzo asked him to grab him a pack as well. Justin got in his car and drove off. But instead of turning left to go back to town, he said he accidentally turned right. He said he didn't realize his mistake until he'd been driving for about 30 minutes. And then his car got stuck. Rather than try to make it back to the party, Justin decided to just head home since he was already halfway there. Justin said that he called another friend, Adam, to have him let Alonzo know what happened and for Adam to give Alonzo a ride home. Adam agreed. That was the last time anyone from Alonzo's friend group saw him alive. On the morning of Sunday, April 4th, 2004, Maria, Alonzo's mother, got a phone call. It was one of Alonzo's friends asking if he came home. Maria assumed that Alonzo was just sleeping in, but when she checked his room, his bed was still made from the day before. He wasn't in his room. He wasn't anywhere in the house. He had never made it back home. That was completely out of character for him. Alonzo wasn't the type to crash at a friend's place without telling anyone. He always came home. Maria immediately started calling family members, hoping someone had heard from him, but no one had. Something was very wrong. Panic set in as they called around to Alonzo's friends, trying to piece together what happened the night before. Justin, the friend who was supposed to drive him home, said that he had called Adam and asked him to make sure that Alonzo got a ride. But now Adam was saying that when he was ready to leave, Alonzo was nowhere to be found. He couldn't find Alonzo, so he assumed that he had already gone with someone else, and Adam left the party. But that wasn't the case. Alonzo was still at the party. It's unknown how they missed each other. For reasons that still aren't entirely clear or understandable, every single one of Alonzo's friends ended up leaving him behind. That meant that Alonzo was stranded, alone, about an hour away from home, and in a town where some people had already made it very clear that he wasn't welcome. That same day, April 4th, Rodney English, Alonzo's childhood best friend, got a call from Maria. The second he heard that Alonzo had not come home, he knew something was seriously wrong. Rodney lived in Topeka, but he immediately jumped in his car and drove to Gardner to help find his best friend. He picked up Justin, someone he had never met before, and together they drove to the farmhouse where the party had been held. When they arrived, they started searching the area. They checked the wood line, the field, anywhere Alonzo may have gone. Then, Rodney spotted something. On the other side of the road, from the farmhouse's long driveway, one of Alonzo's boots was lying in the grass, along with his beanie, the one he always wore. A short distance away, the other boot was found. The items weren't hidden, buried, or caught in branches. They were just sitting there out in the open, as if someone had carelessly tossed them out of a car. While Rodney and Justin searched, a man on an ATV pulled up to them. He didn't ask if they needed help. He didn't seem concerned at all. Instead, he told them they needed to leave. Rodney later said, quote, "At that point, we knew something was up. Something's not right. He's missing. Something's totally wrong. Something happened to my brother." Alonzo's family immediately contacted the Lynn County Sheriff's Office to report him missing. But instead of taking action, the police told them that they had to wait 48 hours to report Alonzo missing since he was an adult. It was a frustrating and likely false claim. There's no actual law requiring families to wait 48 hours to report an adult missing. but it's often something police will say when they assume the person just took off on their own. Alonzo hadn't, and every second wasted meant that the search for him was starting far too late. I want to take a minute to talk about this because it's one of the most common misconceptions about missing persons cases, that you have to wait 48 hours to report an adult missing. This is completely false. There is no law requiring you to wait before filing a missing persons report. So why do people believe this? Well, a lot of it comes from pop culture. Movie and TV shows often portray police officers saying, "We can't do anything until they've been missing for 48 hours. When in reality, this isn't true in most places. You can report an adult missing immediately, especially if their disappearance is unusual or suspicious. That said, some police departments do discourage immediate reports, but not because they legally have to. Many adults who go missing turn up within a day or two, so officers might initially assume that the person left on their own or will turn up soon. They also tend to prioritize cases involving children, the elderly, or people with medical conditions. But that doesn't mean that you should wait. The sooner you file a report, the better the chances are of finding them. If law enforcement refuses to take a report, families can push back by asking for a supervisor, providing proof that the disappearance is out of character, or contacting advocacy groups that specialize in missing persons cases. The bottom line is, if someone you love is missing, report it immediately. There is no magic waiting period. Every single second counts. By Monday, April 5th, Alonzo was missing for a second day, and his family were desperate for answers. Alonzo's brother Billy and sister-in-law Cindy drove down to Lacine looking for any sign of him. Their first stop was the farmhouse where the party had been held. They got a hold of the owner to learn that the house was a rental and no one lived there full-time. But as they peered through the windows, something felt off. Inside, the house was completely empty. There were no signs of a party. No beer cans, no trash, no scattered furniture. It was as if nothing had happened in there at all. As they drove around town, hoping to find clues about Alonzo's whereabouts, an unsettling feeling crept in. They felt unwelcome, watched, like outsiders in a place that didn't want them there. Hoping to push the investigation forward, they went to the Lynn County Sheriff's Office and spoke directly with the sheriff. They told him this was not normal behavior for Alonzo. He wasn't someone who just disappeared. They reminded him that his boots had been found abandoned on the side of the road, and it had rained heavily the night of the party. They asked, who would be wandering around a rural area with no shoes on? But the sheriff didn't seem concerned. He insisted that Alonzo had probably gone off somewhere and would turn up soon. His family left the station feeling frustrated, but still hoping that law enforcement would finally take action. They had no idea their search for answers was only beginning. Lynn County Sheriff Paul Filla, who was a deputy at the time, said he first received word about Alonzo's disappearance on April 4th. He said that same day he went to the farmhouse and searched the property, including the nearby creek, but found no sign of Alonzo. According to Justin, law enforcement initially believed that Alonzo had gotten drunk, removed his shoes, and attempted to walk home, a 50-mile journey, barefoot, with an injured ankle. Despite how improbable that theory was, crucial time passed before the case escalated. By April 7th, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, or KBI, took over and launched a full-scale search. They combed the area on foot with scent dogs and from the air with helicopters, but came up empty. 3 days later, on April 10th, the FBI was brought in to assist. Then, on April 12th, a rescue and dive team searched the creek. At the time, the creek's deepest sections were only about 3 feet deep. Searchers walked along the banks, scanned the water, and conducted an exhaustive sweep. Yet they found no trace of Alonzo. The dive team offered to come back for a second search, but law enforcement never followed up. Authorities interviewed partygoers, but their questioning led nowhere. According to FBI agent Jim McAllister, those interviews, quote, yielded no confession and shed no light on where Alonzo might be. However, their interest in gathering information seemed selective. They questioned Alonzo's friends, but not Rodney, the first person to find Alonzo's hat and boots on the side of the road. Rodney later said, quote, "I was the first one on the scene. I'm the one who found the hats and boots. That's how bad they wanted to figure this out. They didn't ask me anything about it." From the beginning, rumors swirled about what really happened that night. Some claimed Alonzo had been targeted for violence because of his race. Others suggested that he had flirted with the wrong girl, a white girl, angering a group of partygoers. There were whispers that drunk white men had singled him out, looking for a fight. But despite these disturbing allegations, authorities failed to make any arrests. While Alonzo's family did everything they could to help with the investigation, they faced resistance at every turn. Alonzo's sister Demetria said, quote, "They made us leave the town. They kept telling us to get out. Whenever they tried to post missing persons flyers, some locals ripped them down almost immediately. Some people spoke with them, but many ignored them, turning their noses up as if they were unwelcome." The family also repeatedly called the sheriff's department, looking for updates. But after weeks of persistence, they were told to stop calling. Law enforcement would contact them when they had information. But that call never came. After 27 agonizing days, Alonzo's family was finally allowed to search the area themselves again. On May 1st, 2004, they organized a search party of family and friends, determined to find some clue about what happened to Alonzo. They didn't have to search for long. In less than an hour, Alonzo's body was found. Alonzo's father, Billy Brooks Sr., said, quote, "My God, it was awful to find my boy like that. Nothing can describe that pain." He also recalled that when they began searching, the sky was overcast. But as soon as they found Alonzo, quote, "the sun came out." To him, it felt like a sign, as if his son was telling him everything was okay now. Alonzo's body was found in the creek near the farmhouse. He was laying on branches and brush, partially tangled in debris. From the moment they saw him, they knew something wasn't right. Alonzo's Aunt Angela said, quote, "When the family found him and saw what he looked like, we knew there was foul play. We could tell." This leads to a very troubling question. Why wasn't Alonzo found sooner? Investigators claimed that heavy rainfall the night after the party had caused the creek to flood, submerging Alonzo's body under brush and debris. They suggested that as the water levels receded, his body surfaced, which is why he wasn't discovered earlier. However, Alonzo's family strongly disagreed. They believed investigators simply hadn't searched thoroughly enough, because if they had, he would have been found. And they weren't the only ones who were skeptical. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect bodies in water, even if they're in much deeper water than this shallow creek. Yet, in their initial search, they found nothing. FBI Special Agent Lena Romana defended the official explanation, saying, quote, "It's possible that with all the rainfall that occurred, that creek rose and fell on a couple different occasions, which would allow for anything that was trapped under the really large brush piles to become dislodged and rise to the surface." But even with that explanation, many people have still questioned why his body wasn't found earlier, which we'll discuss in more detail later. There is also disagreement about the condition of Alonzo's body. According to the FBI, his body showed significant decomposition, consistent with being exposed to the elements for 27 days. But his family says otherwise. They insist that his body didn't appear as decomposed as they would have expected if he were laying in water for nearly a month. Lynn County Coroner Dr. Mitchell conducted Alonzo's autopsy. He noted that Alonzo's clothes, jewelry, and wallet containing cash were still on him. He found no sharp force injuries, no broken bones, no gunshot wounds, no sign of drowning, and no obvious signs of a beating. But strangulation couldn't be ruled out because animal activity had damaged the soft tissue in his neck. Both the cause and manner of death were ruled undetermined. From the start, Alonzo's family felt shut out by investigators. His Aunt Angela said, quote, "We got nowhere with the local authorities. They didn't even want to talk to us. And then when family members would call them, they told us we were calling too much. Law enforcement ultimately closed the case, stating that nothing they learned suggested that Alonzo was the victim of a crime. But to his family, friends, and many others, that explanation made no sense. In 2019, the U.S. Attorney's Office and FBI reopened the investigation into Alonzo's death. Then, in July 2020, Alonzo's case was featured on the Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, bringing national attention back to the case and reigniting public interest. That same month, authorities exhumed Alonzo's body for a second autopsy. His remains were transported to Dover Air Force Base, where the Armed Forces Medical Examiner conducted a new forensic analysis. The findings were damning. The medical examiner determined that Alonzo's injuries were inconsistent with normal patterns of decomposition. As a result, his death was officially ruled a homicide, but the exact cause of death has not been publicly released. This raises serious questions about the original autopsy done in 2004. The first autopsy was conducted by Dr. Mitchell, a coroner whose past has been the subject of controversy. Before coming to Kansas, Dr. Mitchell worked in New York, where he was accused of overstepping his authority and mismanaging his office. Prosecutors claimed that he had allegedly removed organs from corpses without family consent, improperly stored skeletons and body parts in his office, agreed to resign in 1993 amid misconduct allegations. Even more concerning, a New York murder conviction was overturned after Dr. Mitchell changed the estimated time of death to support a prosecutor's theory, allegedly in exchange for leniency in his own misconduct allegations. Does this mean that Dr. Mitchell's findings in Alonzo's 2004 autopsy were incorrect? Not necessarily, but the second autopsy in 2020, which found evidence of a homicide, raises a critical question. Was the original examination thorough, or were critical details overlooked? The FBI has since determined that Alonzo's death was likely a hate crime. U.S. Attorney Stephen McAllister acknowledged that the original investigation lacked coordination, saying, quote, "There was a lot of activity, all kinds of interview reports, but no strong coordination. It just led to a kind of throwing up their hands when they didn't end up with an obvious suspect." But now, federal authorities were determined to uncover the truth. U.S. Attorney Dustin Slinkard said, quote, "We know that Alonzo Brooks died under very suspicious circumstances. This new examination by a team of the world's best forensic pathologists and experts established it was no accident. Alonzo Brooks was killed. We are doing everything we can and will spare no resources to bring those responsible to justice." The FBI reviewed all information from the 2004 investigation and re-interviewed witnesses who were at the party that night, along with new witnesses. They also took major steps to encourage tips. They announced a $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, prosecution, and conviction. They also put up several billboards in the Kansas City area, urging those with information to come forward. Although the reward remains unclaimed, authorities have reportedly received several new tips since the investigation was reopened. His death was certainly suspicious, and someone, likely multiple people, knows what happened that night in April 2004, said U.S. Attorney McAllister. It is past time for the truth to come out. The code of silence must be broken. Alonzo's family deserves to know the truth, and it is time for justice to be served. For Alonzo's mother, Maria, the reason behind his death is clear. Quote, "I'm Mexican and his father is Black, so he's mixed. They didn't just target one race or kill one race, they killed two. He was targeted because of the color of his skin." And as McAllister pointed out, quote, "It defies reason to believe that Alonzo's death was self-inflicted or that he somehow accidentally tumbled into a relatively shallow creek in Lynn County, leaving behind his boots and hat, all with no witnesses whatsoever." The leading theory surrounding Alonzo's death is that he was attacked and killed by a group of locals, likely after the party. Given Alonzo's strength and athleticism, many believe that it would have taken more than one person to overpower him. There's speculation that some locals, possibly even law enforcement, know who is responsible, but they are choosing to remain silent. One of the most persistent questions is, why wasn't his body found during the extensive searches? While some of Alonzo's family believe that law enforcement didn't search the area as thoroughly as they claimed to, it's still difficult to believe that his body could have gone unnoticed for nearly a month if it was in the creek the whole time. One searcher even admitted that if Alonzo's body had been in the creek, they would have found it. Also, some of the items found with his body seemed surprisingly well preserved for having supposedly been submerged in water for nearly a month. His bandana and papers in particular looked remarkably intact, raising questions about whether his body had been in the creek at all. Could it be that Alonzo's body wasn't in the creek the entire time? One theory suggests that since Alonzo's family noted that since his body didn't seem as decomposed as expected after being submerged in water for so long, it's possible that his body was kept frozen or refrigerated and then placed in the creek after initial searches. While frozen bodies would leave detectable signs, it's possible that if his body was simply refrigerated, which doesn't leave as many signs, decomposition slowdown might not be as apparent. Maria said, quote, "Someone knows what happened to my son. I think many people know. I hope now they will have the courage and kindness in their hearts to come forward. We missed out on his whole life." Maria continued, her voice filled with pain, quote, "Someone took that away from us, and someone or several people know what happened to him. We just want to know. He is my baby and I can't protect him anymore, but I can do this. I can find out what happened. I can get justice for him." Despite the renewed investigation, no arrests have been made. But Alonzo's case remains far from forgotten. His friends, family, and supporters continue to demand answers. And the FBI has made it clear. They will not stop until justice is served. If you have any information about the death of Alonzo Brooks, please come forward. There are people out there who know the truth, who can help hold those responsible for his death accountable. People who can provide the answers his family desperately needs and deserves. If you know something, please contact the FBI at 816-512-8200 or 816-474-TIPS, or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. Next, we're going to Lacombe, Louisiana, to another small community still searching for answers. This is the case of Nanette Krentel. A quiet home deep in the woods of Louisiana was reduced to ashes. Inside, the remains of a woman, beloved wife, stepmother, and former preschool teacher were discovered. The fire was intense, leaving little behind. Initially, it seemed like a tragic accident. But as investigators began sifting through the debris, they uncovered something that would change everything. What appeared to be a deadly house fire soon revealed a far more sinister truth. What really happened to Nanette Krentel? Nanette Krentel was born on July 26, 1967. She lived in rural Lacombe, Louisiana, which is about 50 minutes north of New Orleans, in a secluded home surrounded by nature, a peaceful retreat that she and her husband loved. She met Steve Krentel in 1994 when she applied for a job at a store he owned. At the time, Steve was married with a young son, Justin. Over time, Steve's previous marriage ended, and in 1995, he and Nanette were married. Steve's son, Justin, was about 2 years old when Nanette entered his life. She and Steve shared custody with Justin's mother, and according to Nanette's sister, Kim, she embraced the role of stepmother with love and dedication. Nanette had worked as a preschool teacher, a job she adored, but she had since retired. Steve transitioned from business ownership to firefighting. He joined the local fire department in 1997 and eventually rose to the rank of fire chief. The couple built their home on a large private property where they lived with their beloved pets, a Chihuahua named Harley and 2 cats, Baby Kitty and Smokey. Nanette was known for her kindness, love of animals, and deep affection for children. Her friend Lori described her as having an electric personality. She was funny, full of life, and had a strong sense of integrity. Her father Dan recalled that she refused to tell a lie and always stood by what she believed was right. Nanette's peaceful life in rural Louisiana was shattered on Friday, July 14th, 2017. The day started like any other, according to Steve. He and Nanette followed their usual morning routine. She laid out his clothes, packed his lunch, and walked him to his truck to say goodbye as he left for work. Around 8:10 a.m., Steve arrived to the fire station and settled into his day, unaware that life as he knew it was about to change forever. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Steve's cousin, who lived on a neighboring property, called with alarming news. His house was on fire. At first, Steve didn't believe it. It seemed impossible. But as reality set in, panic took over. Steve said he grabbed his phone, frantically dialing the house and Nanette's cell phone. Those calls went straight to voicemail. As Steve raced home, dread settled in. In the distance, thick black smoke curled into the sky, a sight that made his stomach drop. He clung to the hope that it wasn't the house that was on fire. Maybe it was just the trees. But the closer he got, the more that hope faded. By the time Steve and the firefighters arrived, the home was completely engulfed in flames. Desperate, Steve searched for any sign that Nanette had made it out alive. Maybe she had gone out to run an errand and was safe. He looked into the garage, hoping he wouldn't see their vehicles inside. But when the garage door fell, his worst fear was confirmed. All of their cars were in there. 2 firefighters approached him. He knew what they were going to tell him. Steve later said, quote, "I was in total, complete shock." Firefighters found Nanette inside the home, near her dog Harley. Their initial thought was that she had refused to get out of the burning house, staying behind to try to save her pets. By the time the fire was extinguished, the house was reduced to little more than a pile of rubble. The fire marshal arrived about 2 hours later to begin the investigation. That evening, Nanette's body was removed from what had been the master bathroom, where she was laying. The fire had burned her beyond recognition. DNA testing would later be needed to confirm her identity. In the aftermath of the fire, investigators brought in accelerant detection canines, which alerted to the presence of gasoline, both in the living room and the master bedroom. However, authorities could not determine whether the gasoline had already been inside the house or if it had been brought in intentionally to set the fire. Despite this uncertainty, the fire marshal concluded that the fire had been deliberately set. By Saturday night, just one day after the fire, the scene was released to the family. This decision immediately raised concerns for Nanette's loved ones. When they arrived at the property on Monday, July 17th, they were shocked that they could walk freely through what remained of the house. Her father, Dan Watson, was stunned. Quote, "No one's even investigated this. It quickly became clear that critical evidence had been overlooked." As they sifted through the debris, Nanette's family made a disturbing discovery. A gun had been left behind in the ashes. That weapon, an AR-style rifle, had gone completely unnoticed by investigators. Steve Krentel arranged for drone footage of the scene and even hired his own arson investigator, Rick Jones. Jones also found additional overlooked evidence, including a shotgun and the remains of Nanette's 2 cats. Shockingly, reports suggested that law enforcement had even left behind the DVR that recorded footage from the property's security cameras. Realizing the extent of what they had missed, St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office retook control of the scene and conducted a second search. This time, they made a crucial discovery, a .40 caliber Springfield handgun inside the home. According to her sister Kim, Nanette always kept this gun in her purse. She and Steve had matching ones. Sheriff Randy Smith later stated that detectives executed over 20 search warrants, interviewed more than 30 individuals, and reviewed security footage from multiple locations in an effort to piece together what happened. Unfortunately, much of the physical evidence had been destroyed in the fire. St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Captain Scott Lee said, quote, "Ultimately, a lot of things which under normal circumstances would have been collected as evidence were completely destroyed or lost." The day after the fire, Nanette's body was sent to the St. Tammany Parish Coroner's Office for an autopsy. Given the circumstances, many assumed the cause of death would be smoke inhalation. Perhaps she had tried to save her pets and succumbed to the toxic fumes before escaping. As family and friends gathered for her memorial service on July 21st, they were blindsided by a devastating revelation, one that didn't even come from law enforcement. Instead, the media broke the news first, publishing the findings of the coroner's report. The sheriff later apologized for failing to inform the family before the information became public. Dr. Charles Preston, the coroner, had made a startling discovery. There was no soot or ash in Nanette's airway, not even microscopic traces. This meant one thing. She had not died in the fire. She had died before the fire even began. Dr. Preston determined that she had been shot in the head before the flames ever started. A bullet was found lodged in her skull. The bullet was consistent with the caliber of weapon that had been found near her body. But due to the extensive fire damage, ballistic testing couldn't confirm whether it was the same weapon used to end Nanette's life. With this revelation, the case took a drastic turn. Nanette's cause of death was officially ruled a homicide. I had the privilege of speaking with Nanette's sister Kim, who has continued to fight for answers in her sister's case. She generously shared additional details about the months leading up to Nanette's death, details that offered insight into the fear and danger Nanette was facing. In the months leading up to her death, Nanette became increasingly withdrawn, pulling away from those closest to her. She seemed on edge, fearful even, as though she sensed something terrible was coming. Kim said, quote, "She said something about, 'Things are coming to a head very soon. I can feel it.'" Nanette wasn't just voicing vague concerns. She felt increasingly unsafe and was actively reaching out to friends and family, sending emails and text messages expressing genuine terror for her life. She was deeply worried about her personal safety, enough to take extensive measures to protect herself. Their home was stocked with firearms, around 30 in total, and she was highly proficient with them. She never went anywhere without a weapon. Quote, "I have one in my purse, my car, on my nightstand, in each room, and the cameras are covering the gate at the house," she once said. Those cameras were another layer of security. The Krentels had not one, but 2 surveillance systems covering their home and property. If anyone approached, they would know about it. A dedicated TV allowed them to monitor the cameras in real time, and the footage was recorded on a DVR located in the master bedroom. Nanette had reassured herself with these precautions. She said, quote, "So long as I have my guns and the cameras and I'm at home, I'm safe." But that wouldn't prove to be true. Mysteriously, the night before the fire, the camera at the front gate stopped working. Steve later told investigators that the wireless device powering it had failed, and although he knew about it, he had been too tired to reboot it. This wasn't the only troubling discovery. Investigators examining the scene found evidence that accelerant had not only been used in the living room and master bedroom, but also directly on the DVR system itself. The flames damaged the device beyond repair, making it impossible for even the FBI to recover the footage. That raised an unsettling thought. Someone would have had to know exactly where that system was and how crucial it would be to erasing potential evidence. There were other warning signs that something was going on. According to Kim, Nanette found both a cigarette butt and a knife on the property in the weeks before her death, something that understandably heightened her fears. Neither she nor Steve smoked, and no one else besides them and Steve's cousin who lived nearby had access to the property. Kim also stated that when Nanette found these items, Steve dismissed her concerns and wanted her to give the items to him, but she refused. Instead, she hid them. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly where she put them, but in all likelihood, they burned in the house. Then, in the weeks leading up to her death, a transformer went out twice in less than a month. When Nanette asked the repair worker about it, she was told it wasn't an accident, that it had been deliberately tampered with. Piece by piece, these incidents seemed to fuel Nanette's growing fear. It seems she truly had sensed the danger lurking around her. If Nanette's story resonates with you, please take a quick moment to support this channel by liking and subscribing or following. Your engagement helps stories like hers reach more people, keeping these cases active and visible. The investigation into Nanette Krentel's death quickly became a matter of contention, with conflicting conclusions about the cause of her death. On the same day the coroner issued his ruling, Sheriff Smith expressed doubt, saying, quote, "At this time, the Sheriff's Office investigation does not necessarily support the coroner's conclusion in this case." However, he walked back on his skepticism the following day, clarifying that the investigation would continue as a homicide. Despite this, some investigators remained steadfast in their belief that Nanette's death was of her own doing. Those who supported this theory pointed to the fact that Nanette was shot on the right side of her head at an angle that some believed could be self-inflicted. Dr. Thomas Bennett, a forensic pathologist who reviewed the case, conceded that this angle might support the possibility of a self-inflicted wound. However, he was quick to point out that this was the only piece of evidence that could be interpreted that way. All other evidence appeared to contradict this theory and instead pointed toward foul play. Nanette's family was frustrated by the emphasis on this theory, feeling that it diverted attention from other crucial leads. They were particularly upset that investigators believing that Nanette was responsible for her own death may have caused them to overlook or miss critical evidence that could point to a potential suspect. The family, determined to uncover the truth, arranged for an independent autopsy performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Thomas Bennett. His analysis aligned with Dr. Preston's. Nanette had died before the fire even started. Dr. Bennett clarified that, quote, "Death is not instantaneous, it's a process. To understand the significance of his findings, it's important to consider this information carefully. After breathing stops, circulation can persist for several minutes because the heart continues to beat even after brain death. It has its own electrical conduction system, separate from the brain, which allows it to beat autonomously for a short period of time." Dr. Bennett emphasized that if Nanette had taken even a couple of breaths during the fire, microscopic evidence of soot or gases produced by the flames would be in her airway. None were found. Additionally, the lack of blistering on her skin indicated that she was deceased before the fire reached her. When intense heat comes into contact with the skin of a living or recently deceased person, fluid beneath the skin expands and causes separation between the layers of skin. This is what creates a blister. But if someone has been dead for a longer period of time and they no longer have circulation, this process doesn't occur. There was also minimal blood present at the scene, despite her gunshot wound. Typically, this injury results in significant blood loss. Investigators found no evidence of a substantial pool of blood, even accounting for the fire damage. When questioned about the possibility of Nanette setting the fire herself and then immediately ending her own life, as some law enforcement believe, Dr. Bennett unequivocally stated, quote, "She couldn't have done that. Even 2 breaths during the fire would have left evidence." This leads to a critical question. Was Nanette killed elsewhere and then moved to the bathroom where her body was discovered before the fire? Following the ruling of Nanette's death as a homicide, suspicions grew within her family that foul play with someone close to her was involved. When her sister Kim received the devastating call from their father about Nanette's death, her immediate reaction was, they killed her. As with most homicide investigations, investigators began turning their attention onto those closest to Nanette. In any suspicious death, it's standard practice to first look at the family and those within the victim's immediate circle. And in Nanette's case, there were a few people who raised serious concerns. Justin Krentel. Despite having been in Justin's life since he was a toddler, Nanette had expressed concerns about him, describing him as having a volatile temperament. She confided in family and friends that she was uncomfortable being alone with Justin and felt uneasy about his interest in firearms, believing he wasn't mature enough for the responsibility. Because of these concerns, Nanette insisted that Justin not come to the house unless Steve was present. Steve, however, downplayed the tension, claiming any issues between Nanette and Justin were typical parent-child disagreements. Justin had recently gotten married, and Nanette had participated in the wedding by joining him in the mother-son dance. But this gesture didn't necessarily negate her fear of him. Ultimately, despite the concerns, Justin was confirmed to have a solid alibi. He was hundreds of miles away in Virginia at the time of Nanette's death. Brian Krentel. Another figure Nanette feared was Steve's brother Brian. Brian had a lengthy criminal history, with 36 arrests and at least 15 criminal convictions, including battery on a police officer. Steve himself admitted that Brian harbored resentment toward Nanette, and there was a history of direct threats. In a chilling 2015 incident, Brian crashed his vehicle and reached out to Steve and Nanette for help with getting it out of a ditch. But he wanted this assistance to be discreet because he was on probation. In Brian's eyes, they failed to help quickly enough. Police arrived at the scene, which resulted in his arrest for his 4th DWI. He first blamed both Steve and Nanette, accusing them of alerting authorities. But later, he specifically targeted Nanette, sending threats from prison, including explicit plans to essay her, murder both her and Steve, and burn down their house. Despite Nanette's pleas to authorities, Brian was released from prison in September 2016 under house arrest with a GPS ankle monitor meant to alert authorities if he came close to the Krentel home. This made Nanette feel at ease. However, unknown to Nanette, Steve, and even Brian's parole officer at the time, the tracking feature was never activated. Even Steve admitted to one of Nanette's friends that he feared his brother could have been involved. However, Brian was ultimately ruled out. Security footage confirmed he was at his parents' home during the time of the fire. Steve Krentel. While both Justin and Brian raised concerns, neither was placed at the scene the day Nanette died. But suspicion continued to linger much closer to home, on Nanette's husband, Steve. In suspicious deaths, the spouse is often the first to be scrutinized, and Nanette's case was no different. Adding to that scrutiny were serious marital issues. Nanette had discovered that Steve was having an affair with a woman from the fire station. While Steve claimed that they were working through it, others believed Nanette was seriously considering leaving him. Behind the scenes, Nanette was also losing trust in Steve for other reasons. According to her sister Kim, who shared her recollections with me directly, Nanette had repeatedly told family members that she no longer felt protected by him, particularly when it came to his brother Brian. After Brian's release from prison, Nanette described unsettling encounters at Steve's parents' house, including Brian making veiled threats in her presence. According to Kim, Nanette described one instance where Brian reportedly looked at a bird outside from a window and made a chilling comment along the lines of, "People like that bird need to be permanently quieted," while looking directly at Nanette. She also told family that during a disturbing exchange at Steve's parents' house, Brian tried to take her beloved dog Harley from her, and that Harley, sensing a threat, became so scared that he urinated on her. Despite her clear fear, Steve allegedly attempted to bring Nanette back to his parents' home under the guise of a camping trip, deepening her sense of betrayal. She later told Steve that if he didn't start protecting her, she was going to kick him out of the house. Family members encouraged her to come stay with them, but at the time, she wasn't ready to leave. However, according to Kim, she had mentioned divorce to her father more than once in the months leading up to her death. Steve was the fire chief at the time, and investigators confirmed that he was at the fire station for much of the day. Multiple witnesses placed him there consistently. He left briefly to have lunch with colleagues, but returned to the station shortly afterward and remained there until he received the alarming call about the fire. Steve rushed to the scene immediately upon receiving the call. According to reports, he fully cooperated with authorities, even volunteering to take a polygraph to help clear his name so the investigators could focus elsewhere. Still, troubling questions remained. The night before the fire, the security camera covering the property's entrance mysteriously went offline, a malfunction Steve later admitted he knew about but hadn't addressed. Evidence also showed that accelerant had been placed not only around the home, but directly on the DVR system that stored the security footage, raising concerns about insider knowledge about the home's surveillance setup. 2 months after Nanette's death, in September 2017, the St. Tammany Sheriff's Office publicly cleared Steve. However, the scandal surrounding his affair, along with allegations that he had stolen air conditioner units from ambulances, eventually led to his resignation as fire chief. Nanette's sister Kim also shared that some of Steve's former coworkers at the fire station claimed he joked about sending someone to the house to scare Nanette through the surveillance cameras, something that, if true, is chilling in hindsight. In a significant update in 2024, the newly elected district attorney Colin Sims clarified that no suspect, including Steve, has been fully cleared until the renewed investigation definitively proves their innocence. Today, Steve remains a controversial figure among those following the case. While there is no known direct evidence linking him to Nanette's death, his proximity, the couple's strained relationship, and unanswered questions about the timeline have kept him at the center of public suspicion. Was Nanette alive on July 14th at all? Some have questioned whether Nanette was even alive on the morning of the fire. The evening before the fire, on July 13th, Nanette exchanged text messages with her friend Lori for over an hour before their conversation abruptly ended around 10:30 p.m. That was the last time Lori heard from her. Could she have simply fallen asleep, or did something more sinister happen? Authorities traced activity on Nanette's cell phone and bank records the next morning, including a transaction at McDonald's at 9:57 a.m. Investigators pointed to grainy surveillance footage showing a red SUV resembling Nanette's vehicle in the drive-thru and claimed movement seen in the front passenger seat could have been her dog Harley. However, the footage was so poor that authorities were never able to conclusively identify the driver. Nanette's sister Wendy voiced deep concerns about the video, stating, quote, "You can't tell if it's Nan at the McDonald's, and that's been our top concern, that she was shot that night or that morning." Kim later confirmed that when she reviewed the footage herself, even after rewinding multiple times, it was simply impossible to tell who was driving. She also noted that Nanette wasn't known to eat fast food. If that wasn't Nanette in the vehicle, everything changes. The timeline of events, the list of potential suspects, and even the account of what happened that morning would all be called into question. Family members also expressed frustration over the investigation's handling of the footage. Shockingly, police didn't interview other drivers or witnesses in the McDonald's drive-thru until more than a year later. Adding to the confusion, a call was placed from Nanette's phone at 10:03 a.m. to a Kmart pharmacy about a prescription. Another outgoing call occurred about an hour before the 911 call reporting the fire, this time to a local resident who claimed they didn't know Nanette. They thought it was a misdial. These unanswered questions and the early investigative missteps only add more layers to the mystery of Nanette Krentel's tragic death. For years, Nanette's family has pushed for deeper, more thorough investigation, refusing to let the lingering questions surrounding her death be forgotten. And recently, there has been a renewed effort to uncover the truth. In 2024, a significant development emerged in the ongoing investigation into Nanette Krentel's tragic death. Colin Sims, the newly elected district attorney for St. Tammany Parish, said they were prioritizing the case. Sims and his team have undertaken a comprehensive review, amassing hundreds of gigabytes of data, including subpoenas, search warrants, videos, audio recordings, and phone records. They are re-examining all the potential suspects, including individuals previously considered. Sims said, quote, "This office is not clearing anyone until we have information that is 100% definitive that a person could not have done something." Family members, particularly Nanette's sisters, have expressed cautious optimism about the renewed efforts. They continue to seek closure and justice for Nanette, whose untimely death has left a huge void in their lives. The family's enduring hope is that the renewed investigation will finally unveil the truth and hold the responsible parties accountable. From the moment Nanette's life was tragically taken, her loved ones have passionately vowed to seek justice. Her sister Kim addressed the unknown perpetrator directly, saying, "To the person who killed her, you have no idea what you've taken from this world. We're not going to give up, and I hope you're haunted every day by this." Nanette's close friend Lori expressed determination from the very beginning. "I do this because she was one of the best people that I have ever known, and I know that if the roles were reversed in something like this that happened to me, she would be like a dog with a bone and would not let go. And I'm trying to honor her in doing the same." Nanette's father, Dan, echoed this urgency and intensity through messages he shared online. "There is a cold-blooded killer in our midst, and that should concern every citizen of St. Tammany Parish. This monster has shown a complete and total disregard for human life." Sadly, Dan, who tirelessly urged authorities to uncover the truth behind his daughter's death, passed away in 2021 without witnessing justice for Nanette. His memory lives on through his family's ongoing pursuit of answers and accountability. Nanette Krentel was a devoted friend, loving sister, and caring daughter whose life ended in tragedy, leaving behind deep wounds for those who cherished her. The unanswered questions surrounding her death have haunted her family and friends and have unsettled an entire community. Even after years of searching for answers, Nanette's loved ones refuse to give up hope. Today, her family continues their relentless pursuit of truth and justice, driven by her memory and the belief that someone, somewhere, holds the key to solving her case. They hope that someone listening or watching today may help finally bring closure to this heartbreaking story. I'm grateful to Kim and Nanette's family for sharing their story and continuing to fight for justice. It's because of their strength and people like you watching and listening that we can help keep these cases from being forgotten. Someone out there knows something. Your voice could help finally solve this case. If you know anything, no matter how small, please come forward. Contact Crime Stoppers at 504-822-1111 or reach out to the Justice for Nanette Facebook page. Your information could be the missing piece that finally brings justice and peace to Nanette's family. Next, we'll head to Canadian Texas, where 18-year-old Thomas Brown vanished the night before Thanksgiving. His case remains one of the most haunting small-town mysteries in recent years. An 18-year-old class president, athlete, and straight-A student disappears the night before Thanksgiving. His SUV is found abandoned. His backpack left miles away. His phone mysteriously planted almost a year later. For nearly a decade, rumors, lawsuits, and investigations have divided this small Texas town. What really happened to Thomas Brown? This case was actually suggested by one of you in the comments, so thank you for that. And if there's a case you'd like me to cover, please let me know below. I do pay attention. Before we begin, this case includes discussions of mental health and self-harm, so please take care while listening. I'll have resources in the description if you or someone you know needs support. Canadian Texas is a small town tucked away in the Panhandle, with fewer than 3,000 residents. It's the kind of place where church and high school football are at the center of the community. On Friday nights in the fall, nearly everyone in town can be found at the Canadian Wildcat Stadium, a stadium that actually has more seats than the town has people. One of the young men who once played on that field was Thomas Brown. Thomas lived at home with his mom, Penny Meek, and his stepfather, Chris. His older brother, Tucker, was away at college. His dad, Kelly Brown, lived in a nearby town and remained part of Thomas's life. Family and friends described Thomas as lighthearted and funny, a big 6'1", 200-pound teddy bear. He was polite, kind, and well-liked. He wasn't much of a partier. Instead, he was the kind of student teachers love to have in class. A straight-A kid with big ambitions. Like many teenagers in Texas, Thomas loved football, and he was good at it. He and his teammates had won 2 state championships. Thomas's senior year of high school was shaping up to be a busy one. He'd been elected class president for the 2nd year in a row, he had plenty of friends, and he was preparing for life after graduation. But October brought a change. During a game, Thomas was moved from first string to second string on the football team. He didn't want to spend his last season sitting on the sidelines, so he made the difficult decision to quit the team. It wasn't easy, but soon he began putting his energy into other passions. Theater was one of them. He was getting ready to take the stage in the fall production and was excited about it. He had also taken up 4-H public speaking, where he went on to place 10th in the entire state. In November, Thomas also went through a breakup. His girlfriend, Sage Pennington, was a freshman in college and was living about 2 hours away. The two had been dating since the previous year, but Thomas told his friends and family that the distance was just too hard. They decided to end the relationship, but they stayed on good terms. All in all, Thomas's life seemed to be on a steady and promising path. But just a few weeks later, he would vanish into the night, leaving behind one of the most haunting mysteries this small Texas town has ever faced. On Wednesday, November 23rd, Thomas's older brother Tucker was home from college for the holiday weekend. That night, Thomas told his family he wanted to go out and see some friends. In a town like Canadian, there wasn't much for teenagers to do. Most nights, they just drove around, listening to music and talking. With no school the next day, Thomas's curfew was set for midnight. He was known for being reliable. Penny was strict about curfews, and Thomas didn't test her. Besides, he had plans to watch a movie with Tucker when he got home. Tucker also had a friend over that night, Taylor Russell. Just after 6 p.m., Thomas left his home in his 2009 red Dodge Durango SUV. The plan was for him to meet with his friends at the middle school parking lot, a common hangout spot in the middle of town. There, Thomas met with his friends Caleb King and Michael Castletine. The three of them got into Thomas's car and they drove what was known as Tom's Loop, which was a common route he liked to drive around town. Around 8 p.m., they went back to the middle school so Michael could go home. While they were there, they met up with another friend, Christian Webb. Christian was a year older than Thomas and home from college for Thanksgiving break. Thomas and Caleb climbed into Christian's car, and the three of them cruised around for a while before stopping at the historic Canadian River Wagon Bridge, north of town. They walked around for a bit and then headed back to the parking lot around 11 p.m. Before leaving, they made plans to get together the next day at Christian's house to play pool. Caleb left in his car, but Thomas and Christian stayed behind chatting for another 20 to 30 minutes. Then, Thomas got into his Durango and the two said goodnight. At around 11:26 p.m., cameras captured Thomas's SUV leaving the middle school parking lot. A few minutes later, he stopped at Frank's gas station, about half a mile away, where he used his mom's debit card to fill up the tank. At 12:03 a.m., Penny, who's strict about curfews, texted Thomas asking where he was. There was no reply. She asked Tucker if he'd heard from his brother, but he hadn't. Tucker tried calling Thomas, but the call went straight to voicemail. Interestingly, their messages were showing up as read, but Thomas wasn't answering. Penny immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't like him. As she later said, quote, "Thomas never misses curfew." Within a few minutes, texts stopped going through altogether. Every message came back as not delivered. Penny told Tucker, quote, "There's no way your brother would turn his phone off." Something was wrong. Had Thomas been in an accident? Was he hurt somewhere? Penny, Tucker, and Tucker's friend Taylor left the house to go look for him. Chris stayed home in case Thomas came back on his own. Maybe his phone had just died and he would walk in at any minute. But after searching, there was no sign of Thomas or his SUV. Around 2 a.m., Penny started calling Thomas's friends. They were already home and in bed. None of them had heard from Thomas since earlier that night. At 2:22 a.m., Penny called the Hemphill County Sheriff's Office. Dispatch forwarded the call to a deputy on duty, Pine Gregory. Around 2:30 a.m., Tucker dropped Taylor off at home and then went back to his house. Just after 3 a.m., Deputy Pine Gregory arrived. He spoke with the Meeks for a little while and then said that he would go look around for Thomas. Tucker asked if he could ride along since he knew where Thomas might go. The two drove around for several hours until about 6 a.m., when Gregory dropped Tucker back off at the house. Gregory said he was going off duty, but then assured them the newly elected sheriff, Nathan Lewis, would be taking over later that morning. He said he didn't think much of it at first. Thomas was 18. It was a holiday weekend. Maybe he'd just blown off his curfew. But those who knew Thomas knew he wasn't the type to do that. By Thanksgiving morning, word had spread quickly through the town. At football practice that morning, the coaches told the players to keep an eye out for Tom because he was missing. Around 8:30 a.m., Christian and her father, Trey Webb, who owned a local helicopter business, took to the air to help search. They checked all the train tracks and the nearby Lake Marvin. Flying over the northeast side of town, near a water treatment plant, Christian spotted Thomas's red SUV parked under some trees. They landed the helicopter to check, but Thomas wasn't there. Deputies Brent Clapp and Jerry Lynn Ortega soon arrived. The SUV's doors were unlocked. The passenger window was rolled down. There was no sign of a struggle or abduction. But right next to the driver's side door was what looked like a fresh urine spot, as if someone had gotten out of the vehicle and relieved themselves. There was writing on the windows, something the football players did as a kind of tradition. Inside the car, deputies noted a faint smell of marijuana, even though Thomas wasn't known to use it. Several of Thomas's belongings were missing: his cell phone, wallet, keys, and school backpack. But investigators did find two important things. On the passenger floorboard was a .25 caliber shell casing, and on the driver's side door was a smear of blood. Sheriff Lewis later said the blood looked like a small cut from a finger or knuckle and was not fresh. Later testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Thomas. Family and friends said that Thomas didn't like guns, and he never handled them. Penny and Chris also confirmed that there were no weapons like that in their home. The shell casing was a bit of a mystery. By then, Thomas's father Kelly had driven into town to join the search. From this point forward, there are multiple accounts of what happened, and at times they contradict each other. According to Penny, not long after Thomas's SUV was found, her husband received a call from Sheriff Nathan Lewis, who suggested they believe Thomas may have taken his own life. Penny herself admitted that this was one of her first fears. She explained that there was a history of self-harm in her family, and with Tom being overwhelmed by school, college decisions, and his recent breakup, it briefly crossed her mind that he might have been struggling more than anyone realized. But when she thought about it further, she realized there hadn't been any real warning signs. His teachers all said he was doing well. His grades were great, and he seemed to be happy. Sheriff Lewis, however, would later say that at that point, investigators hadn't talked much about self-harm, and certainly hadn't mentioned it to the family. Search efforts began almost immediately. Scent dogs tracked Thomas's trail for about 3/4 of a mile east until it ended in a marshy area. Crews searched the nearby water treatment plant, Lake Marvin using sonar, and the Canadian River. Searchers on horseback also joined in. That afternoon, around 5 p.m., Penny was shocked to see that Thomas's SUV was being towed back to their house. According to her, the sheriff's office said they didn't need it anymore. Later, Sheriff Lewis explained that the vehicle was so dusty they weren't able to lift fingerprints from it. Penny, however, felt the car hadn't been treated as a crime scene at all. And the very next morning, Sheriff Lewis seemed to change his mind, and he had the SUV towed back to the sheriff's office for another look. Investigators also began collecting surveillance footage from around town. They said there was no CCTV from the gas station where Thomas had filled up earlier that night, but they did locate a video of a red SUV matching his driving through Canadian. One clip showed the vehicle near the Abraham Trading Company downtown. Later that morning, another camera at the county recreation complex captured what appeared to be the same SUV driving toward the road that leads to the water treatment plant, the area where Thomas's Durango was later found. The footage was too poor quality to determine who was behind the wheel or whether there was anyone else inside. What the video did show, though, was Tucker's vehicle passing through the area a short time after the first sighting of the red SUV. At the time, investigators couldn't fully piece together where Thomas's Durango had gone that night or what exactly those blurry images meant. Within just a few days, Penny began to lose faith in the sheriff's department. The SUV had been returned almost immediately after it was found. Search efforts didn't feel coordinated, and it seemed to her like investigators weren't treating this like a possible crime at all. Penny also had her own reasons for being uneasy with the newly elected sheriff. A year earlier, when Nathan Lewis was still a deputy, he had stopped Thomas and some friends near a local movie theater late at night. Lewis suspected they were up to trouble and briefly detained Thomas in his patrol car. Thomas told him they were just trying to find a friend. According to Penny, Thomas later told her that Lewis cursed at him and treated him poorly, so she filed a complaint. She even campaigned against Lewis during his run for sheriff, warning neighbors he wasn't someone she trusted with their kids. Lewis has said that interaction was blown way out of proportion. He said that Thomas later apologized and admitted that he had exaggerated the situation to his mom. Lewis claims he told Thomas to forget about it and move on. Whatever the truth of that earlier run-in was, Penny decided that she needed outside help. So just 5 days after Thomas vanished, she reached out to a well-known private investigator from Southeast Texas, Philip Klein. Klein agreed to take the case and drove the 10 hours from his office in Nederland to Canadian. Shortly after arriving, he met with Sheriff Lewis, and the two clashed almost immediately. Klein later said that he saw Lewis as inexperienced and in over his head. He believed the sheriff was already making decisions that would damage the investigation. Lewis, on the other hand, described Klein as brash, arrogant, and more interested in talking about himself than working with law enforcement. Despite this tension, Klein and his team dove in quickly. They began interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, and even brought in their own specialists. One of those was a cadaver dog named Chance, handled by expert Trace Sargent, who reportedly alerted in several areas of Thomas's SUV. Klein later said, quote, "That dog hit all over that car. there was a dead body in that car. As tensions grew between Penny and the sheriff's office, Lewis started to get suspicious. In an interview, he described Penny as scary, saying she showed no emotion after Thomas went missing. According to him, when Penny came into the office within the first 48 hours, she wasn't crying, quote, she wasn't, quote, tearing the door down, and she didn't act like a distraught mother. He later told a reporter, quote, she has no emotion. I'm scared of her. He also suggested that she was only putting on an act once the media attention grew. He insisted that her behavior didn't make any sense, that any parent in her position would have been more outwardly frantic. But others pointed out that people respond to trauma in different ways. Shock, fear, and even dissociation can all mask outward displays of grief. To some, Lewis's comments revealed more about his inexperience than about Penny's state of mind. As the weeks went on, the public began to hear very different theories on what happened to Thomas. One from Sheriff Lewis and the other from Penny and her private investigator, Philip Klein. In December 2016, just a month after Thomas vanished, Sheriff Lewis appeared on a local radio show hosted by Chris Samples. He suggested that Thomas had left town voluntarily, describing him as a possible runaway. Lewis explained that most people connected to the case had been interviewed, and investigators believed that Thomas had likely arranged for someone to pick him up. By early 2017, Lewis returned to the show and doubled down on that theory. He told listeners that both his office and state investigators were, quote, quite positive that Thomas had left on his own. While they didn't know who helped him, Lewis insisted that someone had, and that someone knew where Thomas was. But Klein strongly disagreed. He said, quote, we know he's not a runner. Thomas had left behind his car. He had no cash. He hadn't used his mother's debit card or his cell phone, and there was no sign he'd planned to disappear. Klein's team began investigating the case as a possible homicide. These clashing narratives very quickly created a divide in Canadian. Some sided with the sheriff, believing that Thomas had left willingly, which at 18 years old, he had every right to do. Others stood with Penny, Chris, Tucker, and Klein's investigation team, believing that something horrible had happened to Thomas. This split only fueled speculation in the small town, and the rumor mill ran rampant. As the investigation unfolded, details from Thomas's private life began surfacing. According to his ex-girlfriend Sage and a few close friends, Thomas had experimented with wearing adult diapers. Those who knew about it said he seemed embarrassed and only mentioned trying it a handful of times. Some friends shrugged it off, while others saw it as something he was struggling with privately. But Penny said she didn't believe it was true. Rumors about Thomas's sexuality also began to spread, with speculation that he might have been gay. Some friends and family denied this, and Penny herself said she didn't believe it. When asked how she would have responded if Thomas had told her he was gay, she admitted it would have been difficult, but said she would have tried to talk to him, while also pointing to her religious beliefs. On their own, these personal details shouldn't really have carried much weight. But in a small town, rumors like this just became fuel for gossip. And in Thomas's case, they made their way into the investigation itself. Sheriff Lewis later said, quote, when I was told about Tom's interest with wearing diapers, that just opened up a whole new thing in wondering, what are we dealing with here? I just knew that we had to put him under a microscope. I mean, I want to call him sick and weird, things that he was involved in and what he was doing. To many, comments like that just suggested that investigators were focusing more into Thomas's private life than into his disappearance. Days turned into weeks, with still no sign of Thomas. Then, on January 27th, 2017, more than 2 months after he disappeared, a worker for the power company was out checking electrical lines along Lake Marvin Road, about 4 miles from where Thomas's SUV had been found. He noticed something strange. Propped up against a tree, several feet behind a barbed wire fence, was a backpack. The man went straight to the sheriff's office to report what he'd found. Investigators went out to retrieve the backpack and processed it. Inside were Thomas's school-issued laptop, along with his books and notebooks. Friends and family said Thomas always kept that backpack in the backseat of his car. This discovery immediately raised questions. Tucker believed that the backpack had been planted there after the initial searches. He insisted that that area had already been combed up and down. Sheriff Lewis disagreed. He pointed to an indentation in the ground beneath the bag and said it was wet and moldy, signs that it had been there for quite some time. Investigators examined the laptop, but it hadn't been used since Thomas disappeared. They also said that the bag was in such bad conditions that it didn't offer any clues. Philip Klein wanted his cadaver dog to check the backpack, but according to him, law enforcement wouldn't allow it. He said, quote, "And if that doesn't tell you something, nothing does." Klein also alleged that deputies who had been involved in the earlier searches admitted they hadn't actually conducted full line searches of the area, even though the sheriff's office originally claimed they had. By the fall of 2017, nearly a year had passed since Thomas disappeared. Frustrated with the lack of progress, Philip Klein organized a massive search of Lake Marvin Road. Between 150 and 300 volunteers showed up. The search had barely begun when a woman shouted. Lying on the ground was a pristine rose gold iPhone, just like the one Thomas had. At first, the searchers thought it must have belonged to one of the volunteers. Maybe it had fallen out of someone's bag or pocket. But when the phone was turned over to the FBI, testing confirmed what no one suspected. The phone belonged to Thomas. That raised an even bigger question. How could a phone be found in near-perfect condition after 11 months of rain, ice, and mowing in the area? For once, everyone agreed on something. This phone had been planted. But by who? Sheriff Nathan Lewis pointed the finger at Klein, suggesting he had planted it to boost his reputation by finding it. He also believed that Penny herself may have placed it. He pointed to a text message Penny sent weeks after Thomas disappeared, asking a friend's mother if her son knew Thomas's passcode. To the sheriff, that was suspicious. Why would Penny need the code to a phone that hadn't been recovered? Penny pushed back, saying she'd only asked because the sheriff's office themselves had requested the passcode. If she didn't know it, she thought maybe Thomas's friends would. But law enforcement denied ever making that request. Klein had his own theory, that law enforcement had been the ones to plant it. He argued that no one knew the exact location of the search until just before it began, except for his team who had picked the site and law enforcement. To him, the phone showing up there was no coincidence. The sheriff's office denied they knew the location of the search at all. In the end, the only certainty was uncertainty. The phone had been planted, but by whom and why remains a mystery. The search that day turned up more than just the phone. A small pistol case was also found, the type that could hold a .25 caliber weapon. There were a few other items too, including some clothing. And once again, Klein's cadaver dog Chance reportedly alerted in the area. But despite these discoveries, investigators were no closer to understanding what had really happened to Thomas. By early 2018, more than a year had passed with no answers. Penny and other moms had created the Moms for Tom Facebook group to raise awareness and push for more resources. In January, she posted a petition calling for the Texas Attorney General's office to take over the case. Sheriff Nathan Lewis said that he welcomed the involvement. He told reporters he hoped a fresh set of eyes could finally cut through the confusion and move the case forward. The AG's office assigned Sergeant Rachel Kading and other investigators to review the files. One of her first steps was to have key figures in the case take polygraphs. Penny agreed to take hers and was asked questions, including some about Thomas's phone. Investigators later said her results indicated possible deception when asked about having the phone, as well as her claim that the sheriff's office had asked her to find the phone's passcode. Chris also took a polygraph, and so did Sheriff Lewis, who, interestingly, also showed signs of deception when asked about the phone. Polygraphs, of course, aren't foolproof. They're inadmissible in court and can't prove guilt or innocence. They're tools that investigators sometimes use to guide their questioning or elicit a confession. Still, the fact that Penny and the sheriff both raised red flags on the same issue only deepened the mystery. On January 9th, 2019, more than 2 years after Thomas disappeared, Sheriff's Deputy Pine Gregory was patrolling Lake Marvin Road. During a break, he wandered into a field looking for shed deer antlers, something he collected. As he moved through the brush, he spotted what looked like a bone. At first, he thought it might be from an animal, but as he got closer, he realized he was looking at a human skull. The discovery confirmed many people's worst fear. Thomas Brown had not run away to start a new life. He was gone. Along with the skull, investigators recovered other bones, a pair of shoes, part of a pair of jeans, and a fragment of a Texas driver's license, Thomas's license. His remains were found about 10 miles from where the SUV had been left. Klein later claimed that during earlier searches, the team had been discouraged by the sheriff's office from looking in certain areas along Lake Marvin Road. He said deputies told him they were running an undercover operation nearby and didn't want it compromised. According to Klein, the body was eventually found just beyond one of the points where they'd been told not to search. While the discovery provided answers about Thomas's fate, it didn't explain how he died. A memorial service was held soon after. In August 2019, Thomas's family received a crushing update from the Attorney General's office. Investigators told them, quote, "There's no viable evidence that would lead a reasonable person to conclude that foul play led to the death of Thomas Kelly Brown. Therefore, this investigation has been suspended, pending any new credible evidence." Sergeant Rachel Kading added, quote, "We don't have enough evidence to make a determination. For all we know, he could have died from natural causes. We have no cause and no manner of death. Therefore, we have nothing to base any type of finding on." And with that, the state stepped away. But around this time, the Hemphill County Sheriff's Office was experiencing some turmoil of its own. In April 2019, the district attorney announced that Texas Rangers had opened an investigation into Sheriff Nathan Lewis, though at first they didn't say why. The DA also declared that their office would no longer be accepting cases from Deputy Pine Gregory, citing, quote, "factual issues" and, quote, "lack of sufficient probable cause and or misapplication of the law." The following month, Deputy Gregory was fired. Then, in November, Chief Deputy Brent Clapp, who had led parts of the Brown investigation, said he too had been let go, with no explanation. Soon after, details emerged about the investigation into Sheriff Lewis. He was accused of falsifying training records and even manufacturing a document in an unnamed missing persons case. Many, including Philip Klein, believed that case was Thomas Brown's. According to reports, it was Clapp who blew the whistle, alerting TCOLE, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, about discrepancies that were noticed in Deputy Ortega's training records. Clapp later said it, quote, "wasn't outside the realm of possibility that Lewis had, quote, manufactured a supplement for a missing person a year and a half after it happened." By mid-November 2019, Sheriff Nathan Lewis resigned. He maintained it was all a paperwork error and claimed he had only been asked to resign because of the embarrassment surrounding the case, not because of any wrongdoing on his part. Ironically, the man who had reported him, Brent Clapp, was soon appointed as his replacement, and he remains sheriff of Hemphill County today. In early 2020, the residents of Canadian noticed that AG investigator Rachel Kading was back in town. Over the next year, she returned several times. Then, in 2021, the Attorney General's office created a new cold case and missing persons unit, and Thomas's case was one of the first they reviewed. The AG also officially cleared former Sheriff Nathan Lewis of having any involvement in Thomas's disappearance, death, or the location where his remains were found. By the fall of 2021, the Attorney General's office and Philip Klein were both ready to go public. The AG's office released a 250-page press packet laying out their findings. The very next day, Klein held his own press conference in Canadian, a 4-hour presentation where he offered his own evidence and directly contradicted part of the AG's report. The AG's conclusions were sobering. After years of investigation, they still couldn't determine what happened to Thomas. Their statement read, quote, "As of today, this case remains a questionable death investigation without sufficient evidence to conclude that Tom Brown's death was attributed to a criminal act, an accidental death, or taking one's own life." The AG's office also revealed that they had considered convening a grand jury to see if new testimony or evidence might emerge. But in the end, they decided against it. They said, quote, "We do not believe presenting this case to a grand jury at this time would be fruitful or ethical. The legal standard at trial of beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Brown's death was the result of an intentional or unintentional criminal act is not supported by any evidence collected at this time." But then came a line that made many people stop and read again. It said, quote, "It is the long-standing practice of the 31st Judicial District Attorney to not present suspicious deaths to a grand jury if evidence shows the death was the result of taking one's own life." That sentence raised eyebrows. The AG had already said, twice, that they didn't know how Thomas died. So why include a statement about self-harm? Were they simply explaining procedure? Or were they hinting at what they believed privately? When journalist Skip Hollinsworth asked Sergeant Kading why they didn't move forward with a grand jury, her answer only deepened the questions. She explained that indictments were likely if the case went to a grand jury, but that the AG didn't feel they could win a conviction at trial. She said to move forward anyway would be unethical. She gave an example. If someone were indicted for homicide, but the state couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, the jury would have to acquit. And because of double jeopardy, that person could never be tried again, even if new evidence appeared later. So according to the AG, the risk of closing the door permanently outweighed the potential of moving the case forward. In their report, the Attorney General's office also laid out the scope of their investigation. They said they had submitted 35 items for forensic testing, interviewed or contacted 71 witnesses, conducted 9 polygraphs and 9 formal searches, issued 150 search warrants and subpoenas, and made 9 trips to Canadian. But the most attention went to a few specific pieces of evidence. Investigators confirmed that at 12:23 a.m. on Thursday, November 24th, Thomas's phone lost power. They clarified that it hadn't manually been turned off. The battery died. The report also detailed surveillance of a red Dodge Durango moving through the town in the early morning hours. At 1:10 a.m., a Durango was seen heading toward the direction of Thomas's house. At 1:11, another Durango, possibly the same one, was seen coming back toward town. Then at 5:28, a Durango again headed toward his house. At 5:30, it returned toward town. And at 5:56 a.m., a Durango was recorded heading toward the water treatment facility, the same place Thomas's SUV was later discovered. Investigators said this suggested Thomas may have made it home briefly that night before the car ended up abandoned. But Klein strongly disputed that conclusion. He argued the footage was too grainy to prove it was even Thomas's vehicle. He pointed out there was another resident in Canadian who drove the same model SUV and said the writing that had been marked on Thomas's windows couldn't be seen in the video. The AG also noted several other smaller findings. A soil sample was collected from what looked like urine near Thomas's SUV, but they weren't able to get any results. The .25 caliber shell casing found inside the vehicle showed no fingerprints or DNA. At some point after Thomas vanished, his Facebook page was taken down, but investigators couldn't determine who did this or when it happened. And after some of his remains were initially discovered in January 2019, additional remains were located in a follow-up search the following month. The Attorney General's report also addressed what investigators had and hadn't found inside Thomas's SUV. 2 small bloodstains were identified as Thomas's. One was located on the driver's side door, spotted when the vehicle was first recovered. The other was found in a different location, though investigators declined to release the exact spot. Neither stain was considered significant in size. The SUV itself was described as messy and dusty, not freshly cleaned as if someone had tried to scrub away evidence. Investigators also noted red and yellow paint inside, which they attributed to a high school tradition of students painting the streets before football games. One of the more contested issues came from a luminol test conducted by Klein in November of 2017. Luminol is a chemical that can reveal hidden traces of blood. Klein said their test showed blood in several areas of the SUV, suggesting it may have been cleaned. The AG's office disagreed, stating the test hadn't been conducted properly and that the results were invalid. They also pointed out that one of the blood spots known only to investigators was not detected in Klein's test, which they said further undermined his claims. Klein pushed back. insisting the test was done under proper protocols with photographs and documentation. He said that after alerting authorities to their findings, he expected law enforcement or Texas Rangers to follow up by conducting their own tests. But according to Klein, that never happened. The Attorney General's report also revisited one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence in the case: Thomas's phone. First, they clarified that the Hemphill County Sheriff's Office had not asked Penny for Thomas's passcode, contradicting what Penny had previously said. The phone's data showed something unusual. Investigators believed that Thomas's phone had been inside a charging case. They could see a plug-in event, but never an unplug, which suggested that the phone had been charging continuously. Friends later confirmed that Thomas often had his phone in a charging case, and he was known for always keeping his phone charged at 100%. But when the phone was recovered during the October 2017 search, it was not in a case. Investigators later said that Penny had told them she had Thomas's case, but that case has never been produced or found. Investigators' interviews with Thomas's friends also brought up more questions. Christian Webb told investigators that on January 10, 2017, Caleb King had asked if she knew Thomas's passcode. When investigators followed up with Caleb, he said he'd only asked because his mother told him Penny had been trying to find out if any of Thomas's friends knew it. Phone records confirmed those conversations took place around that date. So while friends consistently described Thomas as someone who always kept his phone charged, and usually inside that charging case, the phone was not inside it when it was found. That, combined with conflicting accounts about who initially asked for the passcode, left investigators with more questions than answers. Polygraphs became another point of controversy in the investigation. In March 2018, both Penny and Chris Meek were given polygraph exams. According to the AG's office, both showed signs of deception when asked if they had Thomas's phone after his disappearance. Investigators also reported that Penny showed deception on questions about Thomas's location and whether she'd had contact with him. In a separate test, Chris also reportedly failed questions about whether he had moved Thomas's body. 2 months later, in May 2018, Sheriff Nathan Lewis was also polygraphed. The AG's office said he showed deception on questions about Thomas's phone and about the photograph taken of his SUV at Frank's gas station. But those results were hotly disputed. Philip Klein argued that neither Penny nor Chris had actually failed. He said Chris's results came back as inconclusive, which can happen because of fear, trauma, or nerves, not necessarily dishonesty. Klein also said Penny passed most of her questions, except those about the phone and communicating with Thomas. According to Penny, she believed these questions may have flagged her because she had continued texting Thomas after he went missing. She explained, quote, "In my mind, communication is a two-way street. I said I had not communicated with him. Yes, I had sent messages, but I never heard back." Klein himself also said that he took a polygraph and passed. As for Lewis, he later said his test was unreliable because of his anxiety. He admitted he was nervous and having difficulty sitting through the process. He also pointed out that one of the questions asked if he was, quote, involved in the disappearance of Tom Brown. Lewis said that question was unfair because as the sheriff leading the investigation, of course he was involved. Taken together, the polygraph results raised more questions than answers. And as with so much else in this case, the interpretation depended on who you asked. Another major controversy in this case was the so-called gas station photo. According to Penny and Klein, and even a few others, Sheriff Nathan Lewis once showed them a photograph of Thomas at the gas station the night he disappeared. If true, it would have been one of the last known images of Thomas alive. Yet, Sheriff Lewis claimed no such video or photo had ever been collected. Witnesses just added to the confusion. A technician named Ron Bishop said he downloaded surveillance from Frank's onto a thumb drive and gave it directly to Lewis, even showing him how to view it. Later, Bishop backtracked, saying he wasn't sure if he left the thumb drive. Investigators noted he appeared visibly nervous when recounting the story. Meanwhile, employees at the nearby Dollar General told investigators their store had also turned over surveillance from the night Thomas vanished. 3 managers independently recalled deputies picking it up. One even identified Deputy Pine Gregory as the person who retrieved it. But when the Attorney General's office took over, they searched high and low for that photo. Investigators conducted a full forensic sweep of the sheriff's office computers, searched the building, and checked in-car data. They found no trace of the photo. That led them to a troubling conclusion. The image likely did exist, but the evidence had been mishandled and ultimately lost under Sheriff Lewis. The AG said they didn't think this was intentional, but another example of how critical evidence in the case slipped through the cracks. In the end, whether the image of Thomas at the gas station truly existed or not may never be known. What is clear, though, is that potential evidence was mishandled and lost, possibly forever. The Attorney General's report also summarized the findings from the forensic examination of Thomas's remains. Sadly, investigators concluded they could not determine a cause or manner of death. The bones were confirmed to belong to Thomas through dental records, but only part of his remains were ever recovered, which limited what experts could learn. What they did find was evidence of blunt force trauma to his face and skull. The upper jawbone that holds his front teeth, specifically the two top front teeth and the one next to them, had been fractured into several pieces, consistent with a strong impact to the front of his mouth. There was also damage to the cheekbone area near his temple and to a bone deeper inside the skull. These injuries were also consistent with blunt force trauma, but experts couldn't say for sure whether they happened before or soon after his death. Animal scavenging had left additional marks on his remains, but the examiners did not believe the fractures were caused by that. Importantly, investigators said these injuries would not have killed Thomas or even incapacitated him. But because only bone was left, they couldn't know if he might have suffered a concussion, brain bleed, or other internal damage that would have left him in a vulnerable state. No other injuries were identified on the bones that were recovered, and examiners found no evidence of a gunshot wound. They noted that even if Thomas had been shot at the base of the skull, there would have been telltale signs, and those signs weren't present. The Attorney General's report also reviewed the three possible explanations for Thomas's death: foul play, an accident, or death by his own actions. In the homicide theory, investigators pointed to certain pieces of evidence: the .25 caliber casing found inside Thomas's SUV, the small traces of his blood, the blunt force trauma to his skull, and the fact that his belongings were scattered in different locations. But the report noted that none of this proved a crime had occurred. The casing had no fingerprints or DNA, the blood was minimal, and the fractures could not be confirmed as injuries that happened while Thomas was alive. Investigators also noted that there were no known threats against him and no clear motive. The report also briefly considered the possibility of an accident, but they said there was no evidence to support this theory. The only physical clues were the skull fractures, and without knowing when or how those occurred, they couldn't conclude an accident was the cause. The final possibility they considered was that Thomas had ended his own life. The AG's office cited multiple witnesses who said Thomas sometimes struggled with his mental health, particularly around family issues and his faith. According to the report, he had occasionally joked about death in conversations with friends. And one acquaintance said he had once offered to drive Thomas to Amarillo for counseling, but Thomas declined because he didn't want his mother to know, and he was a minor at the time. Investigators also noted that not long before he disappeared, Thomas learned the truth about the death of his grandfather, that he had taken his own life off of Lake Marvin Road, not died of a heart attack as Thomas previously believed. Combined with the stress of quitting football, breaking up with his girlfriend, and the uncertainty of college plans, investigators suggested these could have weighed heavily on him. Penny herself has said that when she first heard her son's SUV was at the water treatment plant, her mind immediately went to the possibility of self-harm. She told investigators, quote, "It runs in my family, and I figured maybe he was distraught about breaking up with his girlfriend. When asked how she thought he might have done it, she mentioned something called the choking game, which is a really dangerous activity when someone cuts off their own oxygen to try to get a high." Investigators also pointed out an Instagram post that Thomas once made that included Kurt Cobain and Judy Garland, stating that they had both taken their own lives. But Judy Garland actually passed from an accidental overdose, not self-harm. And while she had previously attempted to take her own life, that was not the cause of her death. The report didn't establish whether Thomas was referencing that they had both taken their own lives or if he was posting about them in a different context. Ultimately, the AG did not include that Thomas's death was a homicide, an accident, or an intentional act of self-harm. Their findings only outlined the evidence and possibilities. The Attorney General's report also listed several pieces of evidence that they described as unexplained, details that didn't fit neatly into any theory. FBI video enhancements confirmed a red Dodge Durango driving through town multiple times in the early morning hours. The last time it was seen was 5:56 a.m., heading into the water treatment area where Thomas's SUV was later found. If Thomas was the one driving, it would mean he had been on the move for more than 6 hours that night, without a working phone, since his had died at 12:23 a.m. Investigators noted this was strange, given Thomas was known for obsessively keeping his phone charged, and a charging cord was found inside the car. Another detail involved Thomas's brother Tucker. Records show that around 3:30 a.m., Tucker called the sheriff's office and asked to ride with a deputy while searching for Thomas. He was paired with Deputy Gregory, and the two drove around together from 4 to 6 a.m. The family has said Gregory wanted Tucker to show him where Thomas's ex-girlfriend Sage lived. This contradicts other stories that Tucker had left with Gregory from his house, since they were both already there. According to Tucker, during that ride, he noticed the gate to the water treatment area was open. But surveillance video later showed no vehicles passing through the pavilion area near that gate between 3:45 and 5:56 a.m., until the Durango was captured heading in. Gregory's report claimed that Tucker had actively kept him away from that area, something Tucker denied. At 5:47 a.m., Tucker texted Penny, saying, quote, "We drove out to Sage's, to the Y, and then to the lake. We still haven't found anything." Tucker was dropped off at home right as the Durango was last seen on video. Another mystery was the location of Thomas's belongings. His backpack, phone, and later his remains were all found miles apart. Investigators noted that in a straightforward self-inflicted death, you would expect to see his items be found together. But here, they were not. The unexplained evidence section showed that even after years of investigation, there were still troubling gaps. The surveillance, the digital trail, the scattered belongings, all the conflicting statements, everything raised questions. But none of them provided clear answers. The AG's report also addressed Thomas's circle of friends, the people he spent time with the night he disappeared, Caleb King, Christian Webb, and Michael Castletine, as well as his ex-girlfriend, Sage Pennington. They were all interviewed extensively. Investigators said they all cooperated and none were considered persons of interest. But another name came up, Christopher Jones. Jones had once been on the same football team as Thomas, though Thomas quit the team about a month before he disappeared. By the time of the investigation, Jones was serving time in prison for robbery and assault. According to the AG's report, Jones was an unreliable witness who gave multiple conflicting accounts over the years. They said his statements were investigated but ultimately didn't hold up. Still, Philip Klein presented Jones's story in his press conference. In a recorded call, Jones claimed he had been threatened by Sheriff Nathan Lewis, forced to move to Canadian from another nearby town, and ordered to win or lose football games on command as part of an underground gambling ring. He alleged that on Thanksgiving Day, 2016, Sheriff Lewis picked him up, blindfolded him with goggles, and drove him to a location where Thomas was being held at gunpoint by Deputy Pine Gregory. This would have been several hours after Thomas was last seen. Jones said he was told to throw an upcoming football game, or both he and Thomas would be killed. Something that's been noted about this story is that by this time, Thomas had already quit the football team a month before, and Chris and Thomas were reportedly not very close. That makes it harder to believe that Thomas would have been used to put pressure on Jones to throw an upcoming game. Klein emphasized that Jones told this same story to his team 5 times without changing details. But the Attorney General's office said that when they spoke to him, his accounts shifted and ultimately couldn't be substantiated. Jones's claims remain one of the many disputed points between Klein's investigation and the Attorney General's findings. The Attorney General's office concluded their report by emphasizing what they did and didn't find. They stated that both Sheriff Nathan Lewis and Deputy Pine Gregory were fully accounted for on the night Thomas disappeared. Phone records, video evidence, and a review of the sheriff's office showed no credible evidence linking either man to Thomas's death. Investigators also explained that they had pulled an enormous amount of digital data. They even requested what's called a tower dump, which captures every phone that pinged off local cell towers during a specific time frame. In theory, this can identify who was active and in an area when a crime occurred, but it can also sweep up thousands of records with people who had nothing to do with the case, which is why it's considered a pretty invasive tool. There's no mention of whether or not they learned anything from the tower dump. And with that, the OG essentially concluded their report. They stressed that this was not a complete account of every single piece of evidence, but rather a summary of the main findings. The very next day after the AG's report was released, Philip Klein and his team held their own press conference, a 4-hour rebuttal of the Attorney General's conclusions. Klein began with a detailed time frame, narrowing in on the moments between 12:03 and 12:10 a.m. when Thomas's phone stopped responding to texts. He argued that cell phone data placed Thomas within 1,000 feet of the football field at that time. Investigators pushed back, saying Canadian didn't have enough cell towers for that kind of accuracy. At best, the phone could have been anywhere in town. Klein also revisited the marijuana smell that was reported in Thomas's SUV, pointing to Michael Castletine, one of the boys who rode with Thomas that night, who was known to smoke and sell occasionally. He raised other concerns too, claiming the DA had been inconsistent about what records he actually had, and pointing out that when Thomas's remains were found, the sheriff failed to notify the Justice of the Peace right away, which was something that Klein said he was required to do by law. According to him, the Justice of the Peace later received an apology for not being contacted sooner, but no one ever explained how that lapse actually happened. In short, Klein's press conference painted a picture of mishandled evidence, questionable decisions, and investigative gaps, and was directly at odds with the Attorney General's official conclusion that there was no proof of foul play. So after years of investigation, conflicting reports, and 2 very different interpretations of the evidence from the AG's office and Klein's team, where does that leave us? At the end of the day, the theories about what happened to Thomas Brown fall into 3 main categories. Theory 1, accident. The first possibility is that Thomas's death was a tragic accident. But there are serious problems with that theory. For one, according to everyone that Thomas knew, he was not outdoorsy at all. And that night was cold. The low was just 37 degrees, just a little bit above freezing. Thomas was only wearing jeans, a short-sleeved t-shirt, and a pullover sweatshirt. To get where his remains were eventually found, he would have had to walk for several hours through thick brush, rugged terrain, and even cross a waist-deep river, all in freezing temperatures. So is it really plausible that Thomas parked his SUV, got out his backpack filled with books and his school laptop, walked several miles in the freezing dark, dropped off his backpack, walked several more miles, then somehow tripped or had some medical event, and fell and hit his face, and then died in the elements? It seems incredibly unlikely, especially when you consider the phone. Investigators on both sides agree that the phone was planted months later. So if Thomas had collapsed and passed away by accident, and someone came across his phone, why would they keep it hidden for nearly a year? For many people, that detail alone makes the accident theory the hardest to believe. Theory 2, death by his own actions. The second possibility raised in this case is that Thomas ended his own life. According to Penny, just a few days after Thomas disappeared, she met with Sheriff Nathan Lewis. She says Lewis told her, quote, "When we found the car, I thought Thomas had taken his own life, just like your dad had." 18 years earlier, Penny's father had taken his own life at Lake Marvin, while Penny was pregnant with Thomas. Penny said she never told Thomas or Tucker the truth about how their grandfather passed. Counselors had advised against it. Penny told investigators she didn't believe this theory. She said, quote, "It just doesn't seem like something Thomas would do. He didn't seem depressed." His friends largely echoed that. Some admitted he could seem down at times, but none thought he was at risk for harming himself. The 3 friends who were with him the night he disappeared, Caleb, Michael, and Christian all said he seemed completely normal. Investigators, however, pointed to several factors. They noted that Penny herself had mentioned the idea early on. They also found a search on Thomas's phone at 9:11 p.m. the night he vanished, while he was out driving around with friends. The search was for self-harm hotlines made in incognito mode, but investigators found no record of him ever calling any of these numbers. His friends say they didn't notice anything unusual about him that evening. Some community speculation has gone even further. One theory suggests that Thomas may have ended his life, and that Penny, possibly with Chris and Tucker's help, later moved his body and belongings to try to cover it up, unable to bear losing her son the same way she had lost her father. That idea has been repeated in rumor circles as an explanation for Penny possibly having Thomas's phone at some point. Penny has strongly denied those claims. She said, quote, "As a mom, if I knew where Thomas was, why would I leave him out there to be torn apart by animals? I would never do that. I would want my son to have a proper burial." Polygraph results have fueled more speculation, since Penny and Chris both reportedly showed deception on questions about the phone and whether the body had been moved. Penny said that when she was asked if she moved Thomas's body, she became very upset because it wasn't true. Could that emotional reaction have altered the results? Others have pointed to the music that Thomas requested while he was driving in the car with his friends that night. Live and Die and No Hard Feelings by the Avett Brothers. The lyrics are sad, and some have wondered if that reflected his mindset. But others have said they just as easily could have been songs he happened to like. Thomas's ex-girlfriend Sage did share that she was worried that he was struggling. She said that the night before he disappeared, he texted her saying he felt like a loser. She reassured him, quote, "You're not a loser. I miss you a lot." Klein has strongly rejected the idea of self-harm. He said, quote, "If you're gonna harm yourself as a teenager, you want your body found. This has to be a splash. This has to be a big thing. Remember, he's big into drama. People that are gonna harm themselves don't carry their laptops, their wallet, their phone, and I don't think this is self-harm. I really don't." Theory 3, homicide. The final theory is that Thomas was killed, and that someone in Canadian knows what happened. This is the belief held by Penny, Chris, Tucker, Klein and his team, as well as their supporters. Penny has said, quote, "I believe there are people in Canadian who know what happened. I think I know some of them." The Moms for Tom Facebook group has echoed that belief, even putting up signs around town that read, "Justice for Tom. There is a killer among us. Please pray that Tom's killer is found and brought to justice." Supporters of this theory often point to the location of Thomas's SUV. It was found in a remote area near the water treatment plant, a spot so out of the way that even some lifelong residents say they didn't know about it. Christian Webb, who had grown up in Canadian, said she didn't believe Thomas even knew that road existed. The gate to that area was usually closed, but that morning, it was open. If Thomas himself didn't know the area, it raises the question, who did? Klein has floated one scenario, that after leaving the gas station, Thomas stopped briefly at the football stadium parking lot where some other kids were hanging out. Klein theorized that during horseplay, one of the boys had a gun that accidentally went off, striking Thomas. He suggests panic set in and that someone, possibly law enforcement, was contacted to help cover up the death by moving Thomas's body, his SUV, and his backpack. Other rumors swirled in Canadian as well. When Jeff Castletine, father of Michael Castletine, ended his life just 2 weeks after Thomas's body was found, some in town linked the two events. Gossip spread that Jeff and Thomas may have had a romantic relationship and that Jeff's death was tied to guilt over Thomas's fate. But Jeff's late wife firmly rejected that, saying he had struggled with mental health issues for decades and had recently developed some severe health problems. She said his death had nothing to do with Thomas. And it wasn't just Jeff. Over the years, the rumor mill in Canadian has cast doubt on nearly every man in town, even at times suggesting that Sheriff Nathan Lewis himself had been romantically involved with Thomas. These rumors have never been backed up by any credible evidence. But what they do show is just how fractured this community became, with whispers and accusations touching nearly everyone. For Penny and Klein and many of their supporters, though, the bottom line hasn't changed. They believe Thomas was murdered, and the answer lies close to home. In February 2023, Penny and Chris Meek, along with Tucker Brown, filed a lawsuit for defamation. They argued that several people had falsely accused them of covering up Thomas's death, including allegations that they concealed evidence, moved his body, and even hired a private investigator to cover it up. The suit named multiple defendants, including Chris Samples Broadcasting and host Chris Samples, whose radio show had been a hub of speculation. Michael Crane, a frequent guest on that show, and his contracting firm, USA Investigations of Lubbock. Anita Webb, the mother of Thomas's friend Christian. Amanda Lehman, who had posted criticisms of Klein online, the Canadian Record newspaper, along with editor Lori Eszell Brown, and Michelle Gomez, whose involvement was also tied to online commentary. But in July 2024, the case was dismissed, and claims against all defendants were thrown out. Then there was another legal battle, this time over Thomas's remains. In August 2024, the Attorney General's office finally released Thomas's remains to the family for burial. But Penny wanted one more forensic examination, including DNA testing, before laying her son to rest, hoping to uncover new evidence. Thomas's father, Kelly Brown, reportedly opposed another round of testing. That disagreement led to a lawsuit against Kelly and the funeral home where the remains were being held. In April 2025, additional examination was allowed to move forward. A final report was completed, but its contents remain sealed. Penny and her family have pushed for it to be released publicly, and Philip Klein said that it shows no indication of self-harm, and that he and his team continue to believe that Thomas was murdered. Finally, in May 2025, more than 8 years after he vanished, Thomas's remains were laid to rest in a private ceremony. Today, the case remains officially unsolved. Even the signs that once lined the streets of Canadian have become a point of contention and have even been vandalized several times. The residents say they've outlived their purpose, and that instead of bringing answers, they've deepened wounds in the community. Others insist the signs should stay up until there's justice, believing they're a necessary reminder that someone knows more than they've said. Through it all, Penny has worked to make sure her son's memory is tied to something positive. Since 2018, she has awarded college scholarships in Thomas's honor, each for $2,017, a nod to the year he was meant to graduate. 10 students have received the award so far, chosen not just for their academics, but also for being well-rounded, just like Thomas was. When I step back and look at this case, what stands out most to me is how much the conversation has been consumed by controversy. The rumors, the lawsuits, the disagreements between investigators, and the accusations that seem to point in every direction. And while all of those details matter to the investigation, I think sometimes they've overshadowed the heart of this story, Thomas himself. He was a bright, funny, 18-year-old kid with his whole life ahead of him. A son, a brother, a friend. No matter what theory you believe, what's undeniable is that Thomas deserves to be remembered for the life he lived, not just for the mystery of his death. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm, please know that help is available. In the US, you can dial 988 to reach the Self-Harm and Crisis Lifeline 24/7. If you live outside the US, you can also search for a hotline in your country to speak with someone who can help. This case is so complex that I was only able to scratch the surface. If you want to dive even deeper, I highly recommend the podcast Tom Brown's Body. It's a 9-episode series dedicated to the case, and it goes into much more detail than I was able to here. After hearing all the theories, accident, self-harm, homicide, what do you think the evidence points to most strongly? Please keep it respectful in the comments, but I would love to hear your thoughts. If you believe stories like this should be heard, please like, subscribe, and share. It helps keep Thomas's story and others like his alive. Thank you for watching this collection of small-town mystery cases. While these cases may remain unsolved, let's make sure they aren't forgotten. Thanks for being here, thanks for caring, and I'll see you in the next episode.